I think you all know Anatolia, which, by the way, means the rising sun in Greek. But do you really know about it? This peninsula sits at one of the most consequential crossroads in world history, positioned as a bridge between Europe and Asia, the Aegean, and the Near East. Across its long history, it was never the homeland of a single people. It was a space defined by successive societies with different languages and cultures. So the question is, how did a land today known as the heart of the Turkish nation once become the center of the Greek world? The answer is not a simple story of invasion or people replacement. It's about how the Greek language became the operating system of daily life and power. And if that's what you want to learn about, you have clicked on the right video. To understand Anatolia, it helps to start with its geography. The peninsula is not a single uniform space. Its heart is a high central plateau where agriculture depended largely on rainfall. In the west, the plateau descends into fertile river valleys, offering the easiest east-west corridors, linking the Aegean coast with the interior, and making the movement of people and goods possible. At the same time, the score is enclosed by the Pontic Mountains to the north and the Taurus Mountains to the south. These natural boundaries are not incidental. They are what ultimately shaped the skill and direction of human interaction there. Although Anatolia was once the heart of the Hellenistic world, the Greeks aren't the first inhabitants of Asia Minor. The first settled societies emerged in the 7th millennium BC, probably driven by the spread of farming and animal domestication from the Fertile Crescent. These early communities concentrated on the central and southern plains, and while they were capable of impressive craft production, they remained largely egalitarian and kin-based, lacking the formal bureaucracy required for a state. But this started changing during the 3rd millennium BC, when the region's rich deposits of copper, silver, and gold drew it into the orbit of the Near Eastern trade networks. Just a few centuries later, Assyrian merchants were establishing trade colonies there. These networks did more than move goods. They introduced writing, accounting, contracts, and allowed elite wealth accumulation. For the first time, parts of Anatolia possessed the administrative tools required for state formation. During this period, the dominant population of central Anatolia is conventionally called the Hattians. They were not Indo-European speakers, and the precise origins remain unclear. But what matters for our story is that they formed a fragmented landscape of city-states, which were often at war with each other. But soon enough, this landscape was transformed by new arrivals. Sometime in the late 3rd millennium BC, Indo-European populations, ancestors of the Hittites, Pelasgic, and Lydians, entered Anatolia, likely from the Caucasus or the Balkans. These groups likely did not arrive as a single invading force. Instead, they seem to have settled gradually, integrating into existing trade networks, mixing with local populations, and adopting local institutions. By the 18th century BC, control over trade routes and the accumulation of wealth allowed Hittite rulers to begin a slow process of power centralization across the plateau, eventually creating the First Anatolian Empire. However, this imperial unity was fragile. Around 1200 BC, simultaneously with the late Bronze Age collapse, the Hittite Empire disintegrated. The collapse was likely caused by a combination of factors: climatic stress and depleted granaries, internal instability, disrupted trade routes, nomadic pressure on the frontiers, and perhaps seaborne raiders remembered by the Egyptians as the Sea Peoples. The capital was abandoned, central authority vanished, and the peninsula returned to its natural state of fragmentation. The consequences were severe. In the south and southeast, Anatolia fragmented into a patchwork of so-called Neo-Hittite city-states. Long-distance trade contracted, writing declined, populations fell, and no durable power succeeded in reuniting the peninsula for centuries. In western Anatolia, smaller kingdoms, likely founded by early waves of Indo-European settlers who had once been vassals of Hittite authority, show signs of greater continuity. Political structures changed, but local populations, languages, and regional networks appear to have persisted, avoiding the scale of collapse seen in the former Hittite heartland. This region, however, would soon experience new arrivals: Greek-speaking groups. Some scholars argue that Greek speakers were already established along the western Anatolian coast by around 1400 BC, and that the polity was actually known to the Hittites as Ahiyawa. But this remains speculative. Whether Greeks were present on the coast then or not, what is certain is that their numbers significantly increased from the 11th century BC onward. The arrival was a secondary effect of a similar collapse of the Mycenaean civilization in mainland Greece. Competition over land and limited agricultural capacity may have created pressure on populations to migrate outward as settlers seeking arable land and new trade opportunities. And naturally, Anatolia, with its fertile river valleys, timber, and metals, was an attractive destination. These early Greeks settled on the western coast, but they did not move inland. Importantly, they arrived without the state structures they had once known. These settlers were few in number and illiterate. Over time, the Greeks established several city-states. They divided themselves into three main clusters: Aeolia, Ionia, and Doria. The result was a pattern that would last for centuries: a culturally Anatolian interior paired with a chain of Greek-speaking trading cities along the shore. Interestingly, the Greeks weren't the only ones to arrive during the Bronze Age collapse. While the Greeks established themselves along the Aegean coast, other Indo-European speakers were moving into northwestern Anatolia, probably coming from the Balkans. They were called the Phrygians. They didn't know it yet, but they had settled in an exceptionally favorable region, one that would give them access to fertile grain valleys, abundant timber, horses, and rich metal deposits, all the riches to become the next great power. Even though the Phrygian heartland lay only about 100 kilometers inland from Greek cities like Ephesus, those two worlds remained largely separated, at least at the start. But contacts intensified significantly from the 10th century BC onward. Why? Well, because it is around that time that, at last, long-distance trade started to rebound. The widespread use of iron tools boosted agriculture productivity, letting populations recover and generate surplus. Shipbuilding and coastal navigation became more reliable, while Phoenician merchants from the city-states of Tyre or Byblos reopened key maritime routes linking the Levant to the Aegean Sea. With stability returning, local elites could once again sponsor and protect trade, setting the stage for a new era of economic connectivity. Once trade routes reopened, a symbiotic relationship emerged. The Phrygians controlled resources, such as grain, timber, metals, while the Greek coastal cities acted as intermediaries, channeling them into the Mediterranean. Of course, this revived prosperity required practical tools, and around 800 BC, the Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet. This technology spread rapidly, not just for culture, but for practical utility. It was perfectly suited for recording contracts, ownership marks, and laws, all required by this expanding trade system. Despite these advances, power in Anatolia remained fragmented. Phrygia dominated much of western and north-central Anatolia, while in the east, the Neo-Hittite city-states were gradually absorbed by the expansionist Assyrian Empire. As for the Greeks, by the 7th century BC they had formed the famous Ionian League, a loose association based on shared religious institutions. In a context of intense rivalry, the sacred ties provided a minimal framework for coordination, enabling trade, diplomacy, and prestige competition without destabilizing violence, and occasionally allowing collective political and military action against common threats. But this equilibrium in Western Anatolia was short-lived. At the beginning of the 7th century BC, the system was shattered by the arrival of the Cimmerians, nomadic Iranian groups of highly mobile horse riders and raiders from beyond the Caucasus. They would rapidly sack the Phrygian capital, and this defeat destroyed the mechanisms that guaranteed security along trade routes, and eventually led to the structural collapse of the Phrygian system, leaving a massive power vacuum in Western Anatolia. But this vacuum would soon be filled by an unexpected Anatolian power, Lydia. The origins of Lydia are particularly obscure. It is possible that the Lydians had lived in Western Anatolia since the 2nd millennium BC, though they are sometimes described as distant relatives of the Hittites. They were never part of the Hittite Empire and apparently emerged instead from the fragmented political landscape left by the Bronze Age collapse. For much of its early history, Lydia remained loose and decentralized, composed of villages and local elites, rather than a unified state. By the early 9th century BC, they had achieved some sort of political cohesion around Sardis, but it was only around the 7th century that a real kingdom emerged. This power centralization was essentially due to the fact that Lydians were literally sitting on gold. The Pactolus River that ran through the territory carried a precious metal, electrum, a natural gold and silver alloy. For generations, this wealth was scattered and unorganized. When the Phrygian kingdom collapsed, the Myrmidon dynasty, whose last king, Croesus, would become synonymous with immense wealth, was able to centralize authority, turn this resource into steady revenue, and establish Sardis as an urban capital. Electrum was monopolized and standardized into stamped coinage, the first such system in the Mediterranean, according to Sir Herodotus himself. Coinage was a structural breakthrough. It enabled predictable taxation, the maintenance of standing armies, the hiring of mercenaries, and the enforcement of trade route security. Over time, this fiscal and military capacity allowed Lydia to contain and ultimately eliminate the Cimmerian threat, restoring stability to Western Anatolia. Now you're probably wondering, what about the Greeks? Well, Lydia didn't crush them. It brought them under its economic and political influence. Wealthy but divided, the Greek city-states retained local autonomy while paying tribute, supplying ships, and manpower. Lydia offered protection, market access, and regional stability. The influx of Lydian gold financed trade and monumental projects, including the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, which, if you've been to Turkiye, you might have visited, or at least what's left of it. Culturally, the Greeks continued speaking Greek and Lydia remained Anatolian, speaking Lydian. But interestingly, the elites became heavily Hellenized, making offerings to Greek sanctuaries. At first glance, this seems paradoxical. Lydia was the dominant power, so why adopt Greek cultural forms? Well, in reality, it's not as odd as you may think. Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries like Delphi were not just religious sites, they were major meeting points for merchants, envoys, and elites from across the Mediterranean. By depositing large quantities of precious metal there, Lydian kings ensured that their wealth was seen, remembered, and talked about by the very people who mattered for long-distance trade and diplomacy. At the time, this was how a reputation was built and maintained. And this shows how prestigious Greek culture already was. In a way, sanctuaries were the social media of antiquity. And of course, all these broadcasting wouldn't go unnoticed. During the Lydian period, Western Anatolia and the Aegean were among the richest regions of the ancient world, and for the Achaemenid Empire, this open space could not be ignored. By the early 6th century BC, the balance of power around Anatolia had shifted dramatically. To the east, most of the buffer kingdoms that somehow protected Anatolia from westward expansion were all absorbed by Persia, leaving the peninsula exposed. With elite Iranian cavalry, disciplined infantry, and siege techniques drawn from Mesopotamian traditions, Persian king Cyrus the Great defeated King Croesus and absorbed Lydia into the empire in 547 BC. Lydia's Greek client states, which were still politically fragmented, passed under Persian control with limited disruption. Ironically, it's under the Persians that Greek culture and language spread further inland than ever before. And the reason for this is that the stability of the Achaemenid Empire allowed Greek commercial practices, literacy, and urban institutions to operate across much of Western Anatolia. Persian rule was pragmatic, preserving existing systems as long as tribute was paid and troops supplied. Anatolia was divided into large districts, known as satrapies, each governed by a royal official and connected to the imperial core by the royal road, a highway of sorts, enabling messages, troops, and a revenue to move with unprecedented speed. Although the empire was multilingual and relied on Aramaic for high-level administration, Persian officials depended heavily on Greek speakers for naval logistics, accounting, and communication along the Aegean frontier, where Greek dominated the coastal economy. Greek thus functioned as an interface language. Local Anatolian elites adopted Greek literacy, coinage, and legal forms because these facilitated trade, taxation, and access to imperial power. This means that Greek already offered status, economic integration, and political legitimacy because it was the language and cultural package of cities that sat at the junction of trade, law, and empire. By the late 6th century BC, Western Anatolia cities were culturally Greek in practice, even as much of the countryside remained linguistically and culturally diverse. By 499 BC, the pragmatic balance of the previous generation began to unravel. The immediate spark was a failed joint expedition led by a Persian satrap and the ruler of Miletus, an effort intended to reassert Persian influence in the Aegean and secure key maritime trade routes. When the expedition failed, the ruler of Miletus, fearing he would be removed, acted first. He ended the Persian-backed system of rule, announced a new political order, and urged other Ionian cities to follow. This triggered a widespread uprising among the Greek city-states. Yet, the roots of the uprising ran deeper than a single military setback. It appears that years of Persian policies had led to rising taxes and disrupted trade, straining the Ionian economy and fueling widespread discontent that finally boiled over. Although Persia eventually crushed the Ionian revolt, this regional rebellion quickly escalated into an international crisis when mainland cities such as Athens intervened to support the king, and this set the stage for the Greco-Persian Wars. For the next 50 years, Anatolia became a volatile, militarized frontier. Local elites and city-states constantly shifted loyalties, resources were drained, Persia was forced into repeated and costly interventions far from its imperial core, and central authority remained fragile. The conflict ended in a Greek victory over Persia, after which Athens emerged as a dominant naval power. But this new balance of power soon spiraled into chronic rivalry between the major Greek states themselves, most notably Athens and Sparta, culminating in the Peloponnesian War. Naturally, this prolonged instability weakened both Greeks and Persians alike, exhausting traditional power structures and leaving a vacuum that a new force could easily exploit. And that's exactly what Philip of Macedon did. By the mid-4th century BC, he had unified the Greek city-states under the League of Corinth, taking advantage of decades of exhaustion from internecine conflict and prolonged internal strife. After his death, his son, Alexander the Great, soon turned to the century-old enemy of the Greek world, Persia. When Alexander invaded Anatolia in 334 BC, he did not face a cohesive empire, but under garrisoned satrapies, fragmented elites, and depleted treasuries. With his professional phalanx, companion cavalry, and light troops, he seized key cities like Sardis and took control of the royal road, repurposing Persian infrastructure and administrative tools to fuel his own campaign. By 331 BC, Anatolia was officially under Alexander's control. By his death just a few years later, Alexander had officially ended the Achaemenid Empire and absorbed all its territories. But most importantly, it is this conquest that marked the beginning of the sustained and systematic Hellenization process of Anatolia. After Alexander's death, his empire fragmented. His generals, the Diadochi, fought over his territories, and by 200 BC, three major kingdoms had emerged: Antigonid Macedonia, Ptolemaic Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire in Asia. But in Anatolia itself, power was contested between the Seleucids in the east and the Attalid dynasty in the northwest. But despite the rivalries, all the kingdoms faced the same problem: how to govern vast and diverse lands with just a small Greek and Macedonian elite. The answer was massive state-sponsored urbanization. Under the Diadochi, cities became tools of control, military power, and administration. The Diadochi founded or refounded cities at strategic intervals, usually 50 to 100 kilometers apart. Each city had a surrounding territory to tax, fortifications, and garrisons, allowing rapid mobilization against rivals and internal revolts. And finally, Greek civic institutions and Greek and Macedonian settlements, which created a reliable demographic base, loyal to the new dynasty and diluting and dominating local populations. In this context, Greek culture spread as a practical consequence. Coinage, civic practices, and urban planning facilitated governance and social integration across the peninsula. Over generations, local elites became Hellenized as Greek literacy and customs became essential for administration, military service, and advancement within urban hierarchies. Of course, intermarriage between the Greeks and local elites also reinforced bilingualism. As a result, the distinction between Greeks and Hellenized Anatolians blurred, producing a durable Greek-speaking urban and administrative layer. But what about other languages? Well, Phrygian, Lydian, or Carian survived in rural and religious contexts, but Greek was indispensable for urban life. By the end of this process, Anatolia was an impressive network of Greek-style cities, and it is this network that Rome would inherit. By the 3rd century BC, Rome had become the dominant power in Italy and the Western Mediterranean, but it was still hungry for new sources of wealth, trade, and influence. Naturally, Anatolia caught its eye. The peninsula was still deeply fragmented. The Diadochi controlled armies and mercenaries, but permanent rivalries and rugged geography made centralized rule difficult. On top of that, local dynasts in Cappadocia, Bithynia, Pontus, and along the Aegean coast had carved out semi-independent realms. At the same time, Celtic warriors began moving into Anatolia. These mobile bands had been sweeping across Europe in the 4th century BC, raiding cities and sanctuaries and selling themselves as mercenaries. And just a few decades later, they reached central Anatolia. But for local rulers and Greek elites, this was a golden opportunity. Warriors were recruited to strengthen armies, while the Celts themselves gained land to settle. They soon displaced the Phrygians and established the territory that would become known as Galatia. Over the decades, the Galatians became militarized settlers, acting as buffers and mercenaries between rival kingdoms. Ironically, surviving in Anatolia meant interacting constantly with Greek cities, and over time they Hellenized too, contributing to a culturally mixed but increasingly Greek-oriented landscape across the peninsula. Naturally, this constant fragmentation made Anatolia ripe for Roman intervention. By the early 2nd century BC, Rome began stepping in through diplomacy, alliances, and limited military action. When the Seleucids tried to reassert control, smaller states turned to Rome for protection. In 188 BC, Rome intervened decisively. It dismantled Seleucid authority west of the Taurus Mountains, redistributed territory, rewarded allies, and introduced tax farming. And all this while avoiding outright annexation. For Rome, Anatolia was a source of revenue, not a settlement project, so local institutions were preserved, urban autonomy maintained, and Greek remained the language of law, administration, and public life, rather than Latin. By the 1st century AD, Anatolia had become a major economic and demographic center of the Roman world, and Greek had become the sole language of power and mobility in cities, effectively bringing urban linguistic diversity to an end. But as we all know, Roman stability wouldn't last. By the mid-3rd century, Rome faced a convergence of crises that reshaped imperial power. Succession struggles weakened central authority. Gothic raids destabilized the coasts, and the plague of Cyprian killed a large percentage of the empire's population. In the east, the Persians had resurged, and the rise of the Sasanian Empire created a permanent strategic rival. Control over Mesopotamia, the Armenian Plateau, and the Caucasian passes became a shared priority for both powers. And just like that, tax rolls had collapsed, revenues shrunk, and Anatolia shifted from a tax-collecting heartland into a militarized buffer zone. In this context, the eastern provinces became even more critical, more urbanized and wealthier than the west, that generated the empire's largest revenues. It was within this militarized and fiscally strained landscape that Constantine moved the capital eastward in 330. The founding of Constantinople was highly strategic. It relocated the seat of power closer to the primary tax base, leveraged the Bosporus' natural defenses, controlled the corridor between Europe and Asia, and allowed a rapid military response along the Danube and Euphrates frontiers. Constantine's most consequential decision, however, was the incorporation of Christianity into the imperial system. By the early 4th century, Christianity was deeply embedded in Anatolia's cities. Bishops, clergy, and regional synods managed charity, resolved disputes, maintained membership rolls, and coordinated worship, effectively operating as a parallel administrative network. This accumulation of organization, loyalty, and resources posed a structural challenge to the state. An institution capable of mobilizing people, wealth, and legitimacy outside imperial control could become a rival unless absorbed. On top of that, Christianity offered a unifying ideology capable of transcending ethnic and regional divisions and replacing the chaotic patchwork of local cults that weakened the empire's unity. The Edict of Milan in 313 legalized Christianity. But Constantine went further. Between 319 and 31, church courts were recognized. Bishops gained access to imperial communication networks, and offerings were treated as civic contributions. In 325, the Council of Nicaea standardized doctrine through the Nicene Creed, affirming Christ's full divinity and effectively bringing an end to disputes over Christ's nature. And just like that, Christianity was transformed from a persecuted sect into an integrated arm of the state. Constantine did not construct a new religious bureaucracy, he just annexed one that already existed. In 380, Nicene Christianity became the sole legal form of public worship. Crucially, these developments reinforced the dominance of Greek, because in the Eastern Roman Empire, Christianity operated overwhelmingly in Greek. As Christianity expanded into rural Anatolia, it did not adopt local languages, but drew populations into the Greek-speaking institutional world. So Christianity extended Greek beyond urban administration into the domains of faith, salvation, and doctrine, effectively completing a process centuries of imperial rule had set in motion. Yet, despite these reforms, the empire remained deeply fragmented. Its size and uneven development made a single fiscal and military system impractical. Unlike the eastern provinces of Egypt, Syria, or Anatolia, the western provinces were poorer, less monetized, rural, and increasingly unable to finance frontier defense or sustain large armies. Divided command thus became a practical necessity. In 395, the Roman Empire was formally divided into East and West. The West Latin-speaking, while the East was overwhelmingly Greek-speaking. In a sense, this division was an attempt to manage decline structurally. For centuries, the Eastern Roman Empire would continue to rise and fall, facing multiple crises until its final collapse. But that is a story for another time. Before wrapping up, I would like to insist that the Hellenization process of Anatolia was gradual and uneven. As you will have understood by now, it was faster in Western Anatolia. For instance, Phrygian was still spoken in the 3rd century AD, while Lydian had disappeared from inscriptions in the 1st century BC. And this contrast becomes even clearer when you consider inland Anatolia. For instance, Cappadocia. Unlike the Aegean coast, Cappadocia had not really developed dense networks of autonomous cities. So for much longer, it remained dominated by villages, estates, and military settlements. Its landscapes of volcanic rock, deep valleys, and high plateaus must have made centralized control difficult as well. And that probably helped preserve older linguistic patterns. What this shows, I believe, is that Anatolia didn't become Greek because of people replacement, because of invasion, or because of cultural superiority. It became Greek because the importance and the role of the Greek language grew with each new ruling power. I've really tried my best to show the underlying causes of these cultural and linguistic shifts without resorting to identity politics, so I hope you can do the same in the comments. If you have watched this far, thank you so much. I hope you found this video interesting. Sorry it took me so long to publish it, but the history of Anatolia is much more layered than I had originally anticipated, and it took me some time to determine what should be included and what could be left out. I guess that some of you may also be a little bit disappointed because you were expecting maybe Byzantium's defeat at Manzikert, but for me it doesn't really make sense to talk about that story without understanding the broader context of Anatolia before the Turks arrived. So for that you will need to wait a little bit longer. As always, thank you so much for watching, and if you liked this video, maybe I will see you in the next one. Bye bye!